Many of you will know that there was once an infamous study that claimed that vaccines cause autism. And hopefully you also know that that study is complete nonsense.
It is complete nonsense.
But for some reason, not everybody does know this. And a lot of us were far too young when all of this happened to remember the details of what this study was and why it was regarded as such a poor study. So in today's video, I want to tell you all about that original vaccine autism study and all the flaws with it. So let's begin.
Yesterday, a respected British medical journal retracted a study that said the MMR vaccine may trigger autism.
4 children died from measles. 3 died in Ireland, 1 died in England. Died from a disease that was perfectly and safely prevented by a vaccine, died because of that paper.
Dr. Wakefield, I'm sorry to interrupt. Brian Deere, Channel 4 Television. Could I talk to you about your research, sir, and your commercial ambitions?
So, the study was published in 1998. It was led by somebody called Dr. Andrew Wakefield, and Dr. Andrew Wakefield somehow got this study published in The Lancet, a very prestigious British medical journal which is still regarded as prestigious today despite it having a history of publishing some pretty garbage papers like this one. So Andrew Wakefield's study claimed that the measles, mumps and rubella or MMR vaccine was linked to development of autism in children. Here's how the study worked. The study involved only 12 children, which is obviously an extremely small sample size, which means that with a sample size that small, no matter what the results of this study was, the results would basically be meaningless. But not only was the sample size just 12 children, but those 12 children were, quote, children referred to a pediatric gastroenterology unit with a history of normal development followed by loss of acquired skills, including language, together with diarrhea and abdominal pain. AKA, they were children who already had a history of behavioral issues and other abnormalities. So after recruiting these 12 kids, Andrew Wakefield ran some tests on them, various different medical diagnostic tests, including a colonoscopy. And after he had supposedly done these tests, he came to some pretty interesting conclusions. In his paper, Wakefield described a constellation of different bowel symptoms that were supported by evidence from his other diagnostic tests that he ran on the kids. He claimed that there was evidence in these children of a new syndrome which he would later call autistic enterocolitis. Wakefield was suggesting that this vaccine causes autism and that the mechanism by which it does so is by causing inflammation in the intestine, which would then lead to a release of proteins that would somehow make its way to the brain, affecting the brain's function and causing autism.
Bowel is allowing toxins from the gut to get through into the bloodstream, into the brain, and maybe damaging the developing brain.
You're saying this infection comes from the MMR vaccination?
That is the hypothesis that we're testing based upon the coherence of the parent story.
His supposed evidence for this was that 8 of the 12 kids who had these behavioral problems had received the MMR vaccine around 2 weeks before they started developing their first symptoms. And that's what Wakefield told the press. When this paper was originally published in 1998, Wakefield held a press conference in conjunction with the publication of the paper. And he told the press that he recommends that the MMR vaccine shouldn't be administered to children, but instead should be administered as 3 separate vaccines, one for measles, one for mumps, one for rubella.
If you use the single vaccines, you space them over time to separate the exposures, and therefore if it's the combined exposure that it's a risk, then you can prevent this potential and disastrous consequence.
He said that no such issue occurred when these vaccines were given separately. A statement which he had absolutely no evidence for because his study was not looking at individual administration of these vaccines. Now, if you're unfamiliar with scientific methodology, then you might think that Andrew Wakefield's approach sounds pretty plausible. But let me reassure you that this is not how a proper, robust medical trial should be run. A real robust medical trial should have a large sample size and it should have a control group, which means that if this study was to be done properly, you'd have a very large sample of children, a healthy population of children, and you would give half of them the MMR vaccine to see how many of them develop autism in both the unvaccinated and vaccinated group. That's how you establish causality between the intervention and the outcome. Without this control group and without a large sample, the results of this study are completely unreliable, and there's no way to establish a reliable causal link between the action of giving the vaccine and the outcome of developing autism. But later investigations into Wakefield's study revealed that not only was his methodology terribly flawed, but there turns out to be also major conflicts of interest and ethical issues with the way that Wakefield was dealing with his study. One major conflict of interest was that Wakefield was funded by lawyers who were suing manufacturers of a vaccine. Therefore, he stood to gain financially by making vaccines look bad. And not only that, but the specific vaccine that Wakefield was rubbishing, the MMR vaccine, was a direct competitor to a vaccine that Wakefield held a patent for. Wakefield held a patent for a single measles vaccine, which would have been a direct competitor to the MMR vaccine, which is why it makes sense in the press conference he was encouraging the administration of single vaccines. And as if that wasn't enough, there were also some really disturbing ethical violations. You'll remember me saying that part of the procedure for this study was Wakefield giving children a colonoscopy, a process where obviously you are having children stripped down and putting something up their butt. Well, it turns out that Wakefield had no ethical approval to do any of that. Pretty gross. Now, I should give credit here to a man named Brian Deere, a journalist at the Sunday Times, who was the one who did the most investigating into this study. He looked into this study with incredible rigor and found a lot of the things that I'm talking to you about today. In fact, it was after Brian Deere published his lengthy investigation into this specific autism vaccine study that the study was finally retracted from The Lancet 12 years later. In 2010, The Lancet fully retracted Andrew Wakefield's autism MMR vaccine study. Not only that, but Andrew Wakefield lost his medical license due to ethical violations and fraud. What fraud am I talking about? Well, in 2011, Brian Deere published a series of articles in the BMJ, or the British Medical Journal, where he explained that not only was this study methodologically flawed in its tiny meaningless sample size, but that tiny meaningless amount of data that was presented in this study was also largely fraudulent. Brian Deere explained that in fact 3 of the children who were reported to have regressive autism didn't actually have any autism at all, and most of the other cases where the children were diagnosed with regressive autism, whether they really did based on their symptoms is pretty unclear. In fact, from Brian Deere's investigation, it seems like only 1 kid definitely had regressive autism out of the 12. Additionally, despite the paper claiming that all 12 children were normal before receiving the MMR vaccine, Deere found that at least 5 of the kids showed pre-existing developmental concerns prior to receiving the vaccine. Also, in 9 of the 12 children, the colonoscopy actually showed no evidence of inflammation or anything abnormal, but these observations were later changed after a medical school research review to non-specific colitis basically changed because Andrew Wakefield felt like it. And in addition to that, the parents of these children who took part in this study were recruited from anti-MMR campaigners. So that obviously makes the sample biased. So the study is clearly complete nonsense, but by that point, the damage had already been done. Millions of people around the world believe that vaccines cause autism, and a shocking number of people today still believe this as well. So to try and quell this unreasonable belief that a minority of us, but still far too many parents have, let me tell you about subsequent studies that looked into this in a much more robust way. Subsequent studies looking at the link between the MMR vaccine and autism have been conducted on literally millions of children across the entire globe. And the overwhelming message that is coming from this much more robust body of evidence shows that there is absolutely no link between the MMR vaccine and autism, and for that matter, there's no link between any other vaccines and autism. To give just one example of this, here is a Danish large-scale study that involved over 650,000 children that concluded that the MMR vaccine is not linked to autism. So if you've listened to all of that and you've watched this video to this point and you're still on the fence, let me frame it this way. You can either believe the really dodgy study that only had 12 children in it, or you could believe the large-scale Danish study which was much more robust with 650,000 children in it. You tell me which one you think is more reliable evidence. And of course, my opinion is also the opinion of many major medical health bodies around the world, including the CDC, the World Health Organization, and the American Academy of Pediatrics. they have all consistently stated that vaccines do not cause autism, and that the benefits of receiving vaccines in the way that, they stop your kids from getting really sick or dying, those benefits far outweigh the basically negligible risk of your child developing autism as a result of the vaccine. Now, I know many of you who watch my channel have some pretty strong opinions when it comes to the COVID vaccine. I'm not making any comments about that vaccine in this video, but I am pretty confident when I say that vaccines don't cause autism, especially not the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. Thank you guys for watching. Subscribe if you haven't already. We're almost at 100,000 subscribers, and I would love to reach there very soon, so please help me out. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.